I'm just having a conversation on the internet with someone who wanted to follow up with me after watching my video discussing the definition and history of communism. So this is going to be a lot less confrontational, I think, than the quote-unquote debates I had recently with communists on the internet. I don't even know. Catherine, do you consider yourself a communist? Would you say that you are a member of a communist party or a supporter of communism?
Yeah, I definitely am a communist.
Okay, so that's an interesting place to start then. Now, I take it correct me if I'm wrong, I take it your fundamental disagreement with me is that you don't like the empirical and historical approach I have of really insisting that like the history of the last 200 years matters, that tells us what communism means and what the problems are, that we can learn that from studying history. I take it that's your objection, yeah?
I think that's mostly just rhetoric, and I think it's irrelevant to discussing the actual concept of communism and whether it can be achieved.
Okay, so let me ask you to define what you mean by rhetoric and something being only rhetoric. And I'll just give one illustration. I don't think you would accept it if somebody said that the history of capitalism is only rhetoric. I don't think you would accept it if someone said that the history of Buddhism or the history of Nazism is only rhetoric and doesn't matter for the reality of those concepts and those political tendencies.
I'm not sure how exactly to answer your question. I would be more than willing to admit that we don't have true, like quote unquote, true capitalism in the modern world. I'm more than happy to admit that we don't have true capitalism in the modern world. And yeah, I mean, there's always an idea of what exactly something is versus what something pretended to be. And if you want to, I can say that Nazis were like a special brand of fascists, and that not all fascists are racist. And we can definitely have that discussion.
Right. So you can imagine that's the opposite of the point I'm making, though, right? So you probably know this about me. You might not. I was a scholar of Buddhism for about 10 years. If you want to talk about what is Buddhism, what are the advantages and disadvantages of having a Buddhist society, my approach is going to be based entirely on historical reality. And I think it would be ridiculous if someone said what you're saying, that no, historical reality doesn't matter. And your way of putting it is that's only rhetoric. So I don't know what rhetoric would mean. I mean, if rhetoric is an excuse to ignore 2,000 years of history, that's not a word I understand.
Wait, so okay, fine. I don't know if this is what you're trying to say, but if your argument against communism is, oh, but look at how many people Stalin killed, then that's just baseless and meaningless and irrelevant to the conversation we're having. Also,
okay, it's not so.
As well, so
we're at the start of this conversation, so we're defining the conversation right now. I've got to tell you that is not irrelevant to the conversation I'm having. And if you wanted to talk about the history of Buddhism or any other ideology, I would also be talking about historical reality. I learn truth from facts. That's actually a communist slogan, you might not know. And again, Karl Marx himself, his method, so-called historical materialism, was all about proceeding from historical reality. So even if I were a communist or a Marxist, which I'm not, my method here would be quite easy to defend, that no, historical reality really matters.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. That is, do you think that if I identify as a communist, it means that I would be condoning all the atrocities that were conducted under the different historical regimes like Stalinism or Maoism or whatever?
So the question isn't really would I personally. I think the question has to be asked, and by the same token, but by the same token, if I meet someone who's Catholic, I think I can ask them, look, do you really approve of the history of genocide and conquest that the Catholic Church is a part of? And maybe they'll say yes, and maybe they'll say no, maybe they'll have something else to say. If you meet someone who identifies openly as a Nazi, do you assume that if they tell you that they're a Nazi, don't you assume that they're also anti-Semitic or racist? They might not be. You might be surprised, but that's a pretty natural assumption, is that they approve of those historical aspects of fascism in Germany.
I don't approve of classifying people so easily based on or like forming judgments so quickly about them. I have definitely met people, at least online, who claim to be Nazis or something. And if I like, it's a lot more complex. Just okay, so it's like this. If I believe that the means of production should be owned by the public or whatever. If I say that I want to abolish private property, does it also mean that I want to genocide political dissenters or throw people into gulags? I think that's a terrible conclusion to make about my beliefs.
So you made about 3 points there. I'm going to respond to the first part first. It's not about me calling someone a communist or me calling someone a fascist. This is about you self-identifying as a communist. So I think it's fine. You raise the question of my motivation in categorizing somebody, right? But that's not actually what we're discussing here. It's also, if we're talking about Catholicism or Buddhism, right? This is someone who self-identifies with a given ideology. So I think there is a question, what would be your motivation? Why would you choose to describe yourself with this ideology? I think you can recognize when you meet someone who describes themselves as a Nazi or describes themselves as something else, then you're going to make assumptions and you're going to ask questions. You're going to learn what would be their motivation in using that label, in using that category.
I don't really know how to answer that question. If someone believes in abolishing private property, if someone believes in the core tenets of communism, they are a communist. It doesn't matter whether they identify or not. It's the same. It's like the inherent property of an object. I'm just using the word communist to define a person's beliefs. It's a label. Labels apply themselves. It's like, say, it's the same thing. If I'm attracted to men, I'm heterosexual. I don't need to identify as a heterosexual person. It's the same thing. There's no need to identify as a communist.
But you do. You choose to.
Well, yeah, but even if I didn't identify as a communist, I would still be a communist. Do you understand what I'm saying? I think these labeling and identity politics or whatever you call it, I think that's stupid. People's I don't see why I have to choose to identify as a communist.
You don't. You chose. I'm asking you what would motivate you to do that. Why would you be motivated to call yourself a communist, given the terrible reputation for mass murder this ideology has? That's a pretty good reason not to call yourself a communist.
Because it's true.
Jesus Christ.
I'm not going to participate if people are going to interrupt. I agreed to talk to one person one-on-one.
Because I identify as communist because I am communist. I don't really know what else to say about that. This is the same as I've heard people use this argument, I don't condone the mass murder of animals, and I definitely do follow a plant-based diet. I'm just not going to call myself a vegan because the vegan community has some kind of so many idiotic people in it or something like that. Do you think that's okay? I mean, that would be the same thing, right?
Catherine, Catherine, I'm going to answer now. No, Catherine, I think it would be really meaningful for you at age 24 if you decided that the historical record of mass murder under communism matters and that you're not going to make excuses for it and that you're not going to describe yourself with that term precisely because it associates you with that odious history. Now, by the same token, I think it's really meaningful, for example, when I meet Indigenous people in Canada, so we say American Indians, First Nations, we use these different terms. When I meet people like that who tell me that they still believe in God and they maybe even still pray to God, but they do not describe themselves as Catholic anymore because they reject the authority of the Catholic Church and the history of genocide and so on associated with the Catholic Church. I think that's meaningful. Now, maybe you don't. Maybe you want to laugh at that. I wouldn't laugh at that, and I wouldn't laugh at you if you made an ethical decision that, you know what, because people like Joseph Stalin and Lenin, and even Marx himself to some extent, they all defined this term, they dragged it through the mud or whatever, they gave it the meaning it now has, that's not a term you'd want to describe yourself with. I think that's really meaningful.
Okay, so here's what I'm saying, right? When I take Marx, when I take a book written by Karl Marx, like for example, let's say that I'm reading the Communist Manifesto or Capital. I read what's written there, and I read this kind of stuff, and then I go like, oh, I agree with this. So am I a Marxist now?
Whether you're a Marxist or not is up to you. Nobody's disputing that.
But I read it and I agree with everything that's said there, and I would even get into a debate like this with you. I mean, how productive is? I don't even understand. I mean, I want to isolate Marx's ideas from what Stalin.
Right. So, but that's exactly. But Catherine, you know this. That's why many people on the left will say that they are Marxian, but that they are not communist, that they are not Stalinist, that they reject Stalin and Lenin. That's very common. That they reject Mao Zedong. That's very common on the left.
I'm okay. So I'm not a Stalinist. That's how I would describe it. I'm a Marxist. I'm not a Stalinist. I'm not a Maoist.
So don't you think that's a significant? I'm not going to participate if people are going to interrupt. Don't you think that's a significant moral distinction? I think you do. You began this discussion by trying to claim that there's no important moral distinction there, but I think you agree with me. I think you think it's meaningful also to clarify that you're enthusiastic about Karl Marx, but that you're not a follower of Stalin or Lenin or Mao Zedong. That makes sense, right?
Well, I honestly, I don't know what to say. Like, it's that I still think you're using rhetoric here. I don't.
You sound really flustered about such a simple question. Like, you sound really flustered and like you're really having difficulty. And this is really pretty basic. I don't know why this would be hard for you.
I mean, why is this bald retard being like...
I'm not going to participate. I'm going to mute this guy. I'm not going to participate if you're going to interrupt.
Manny, can you just not, please?
Yeah, I agreed to have a one-on-one conversation with this person. That's all we're going to have.
I do think you're being condescending. I do think you're being condescending. How does my age, being 24 years old, have to do with anything you brought it up? But okay, I'm just going to dismiss that because it's relevant to the conversation.
How have I been condescending? And what?
Why do you only? I mean, what exactly do you criticize about communism other than Stalin? Or seriously, whenever whenever I'm having a discussion with someone and then they're like, "Oh, but look at USSR, look at all that stuff." I mean, there's so much to unpack here. There is so much to unpack there. I mean, I'm not against. Like, do you have any idea what Stalin or Lenin or Mao, like, do you have any idea what these people's principles were, or what they actually espoused? Or
so, Catherine, you saw that video from me about the history of communism, right? You saw that at least.
No, I haven't seen your video, but I'm quite.
Okay, so you said earlier that you had, so you lied to me, unfortunately. You told me that a couple days ago. Okay, so.
Never claimed to have.
Okay. So, Catherine, then if you haven't seen any videos from me on the topic, or you haven't read, say, articles or looked at articles, yes, I have decades and decades of research on the history of communism. I know an enormous amount about the history of communism. So I don't know what to tell you. If you don't want to really slow down the conversation, I could break down for you how I started studying communism at a very early age, how I studied it in different university contexts, in different languages, how I've lived in different communist countries, how I've known and spoken to communist professors, how my own parents were communists, I have a huge amount. Well, no, Catherine, you just asked me. It's not irrelevant because it's answering your question. You asked, do I know what the principles espoused by people like Lenin, Stalin, and Mao Zedong are? Yes. I know an enormous amount about the history of communism. So, Catherine, let me ask you, what kind of person in the year 2019 is motivated to make excuses for and defend Nazism? And what kind of person in the year 2019 is motivated to make excuses for and defend communism? What motivates this kind of behavior on the internet?
What? These are questions that are entirely based on rhetoric. I don't even want to, I don't know.
How is that rhetoric? You seem to just dismiss anything as rhetoric that you don't want to think about.
Okay. Let me answer your question, right? You asked me what kind of person would defend Nazism. I don't know. I'm not defending Nazism. You asked me what kind of person would defend communism. I don't know. I don't know about other people. I know about myself, and I know other people who I've talked to and their reasons for being communism. This is entirely pointless. Aside from history, do you have any actual...
Catherine, do you not think you sound really flustered and really defensive in talking about really, really simple questions here? I'm not going to... If you want to talk to me about Buddhism, so you said earlier that you identify as a Buddhist. If you were to ask me questions about the history and politics of Buddhism, I would not be flustered and defensive like this. Now, I also say, you asked me if I know about the doctrine, the actual beliefs of Mao Zedong, Lenin, and Stalin. Do you?
I do, yeah.
Okay, so what kind of sources do you know from? Did you study this in university textbooks, or did you look it up on YouTube? What's your source?
I read their things. I've read Capital. I've read State and Revolution. That's how I know what they talked about, because I've read their books.
Okay, and how do you know about Buddhism?
Because I've read about it. That's it. I haven't actually gone to university and studied or something, but.
Okay. So I have one more question for you. What did the communists do to the Buddhists? What's the history of that like?
I don't know.
Well, why wouldn't you know that? You're interested in both these things. Why wouldn't you know about the history of mass murder and repression of communists destroying? Well, that seems like the sort of thing you'd know about.
Sure. My question is, how is any of this relevant to actual communism? I thought we were having a debate on actual communist theories and things like that.
We are. You just don't know it yet.